Across the four different resurrection accounts in the Gospels, there are a lot of differences, and most of them are things that can be made to work together, but some of them aren't. Those would be contradictions, places where two different details can't be true at the same time. These contradictions being in the Gospel doesn't mean that there can't be truth in the Bible or in the Gospels, but it would mean that the Bible isn't inerrant or perfect, and that's the focus today. The first of these contradictions is where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. In Matthew, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary get to the tomb, see an angel who tells them of Jesus' resurrection, then they run to tell the disciples of what they saw. It's as they're running that Jesus appears to them. In the book of John, Mary Magdalene runs to the tomb, sees that it's empty, runs to tell Peter and John, they run back to check the tomb, and after they've checked it, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene as she's weeping at the tomb. These two accounts cannot both be fully true. Jesus cannot have appeared to Mary Magdalene both after she saw an empty tomb, ran to others, ran back and at the garden, and also after she saw an angel deliver a message at the tomb and while running back to others to tell them that message. The second of these contradictions is where the angel appeared to the women at the tomb. In Matthew, the angel is sitting on top of the tombstone after having rolled it back when he speaks to the women. In Mark and Luke, the angel or angels deliver their message from inside the tomb. In John, there aren't any angels when Mary Magdalene first arrives at the tomb. Then after she runs to Peter and John and returns later, there are two angels in the tomb before the appearance of Jesus. These four accounts cannot all be fully true. The angel or angels cannot have both met the women first outside the tomb on the stone, inside the tomb, and meet Mary nowhere at all the first time, then at the tomb later on. The third of these contradictions is who the women tell about what they saw at the tomb. In Luke and John, Mary Magdalene and others tell the disciples about what they saw at the tomb, but in Mark the passage ends by saying, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." These cannot both be the case. The women cannot have both told the disciples of angels and an appearance of Jesus, and also have told them nothing. The fourth contradiction is what information the women told others. In Luke, Mary Magdalene and the other women tell the disciples of the angels and their message at the tomb. But in John, Mary Magdalene initially says that the tomb was empty without mentioning angels, then later on tells of Jesus himself appearing to her. Matthew doesn't actually depict the women sharing with disciples, but assuming that they made it to the disciples, they would have shared of an angel's message as well as Jesus meeting them on the way back. These cannot all be true at the same time. Setting aside Matthew's account, the women cannot have both told the disciples that the tomb was empty and that the tomb had angels inside with a divine message.
Objection!
Well, maybe the women didn't all see the same things. Maybe the women came to the tomb together, but when Mary Magdalene saw that the tomb was empty, she ran off immediately to tell the disciples of what she saw, leaving the other women to witness the angels and their message. Jesus appeared to the other women as they were running back after hearing from the angels, and appeared to Mary Magdalene later after she had returned to the tomb. That would explain both why there are two different appearances of Jesus at different times and places, and why the messages that are shared by the women in Luke and John are so different. John has Mary Magdalene saying the tomb was empty because that's all she saw. Luke had angels and a divine message because that's what the other women saw. This explanation does not work with the text of the books in question. Mary Magdalene is there throughout the narrative in Matthew, with the author naming two women at the beginning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, then referring to them in the plural throughout the rest of the narrative, through to meeting Jesus on the way back. Mary Magdalene is there throughout the narrative in Luke as well, with the author of Luke explicitly naming Mary Magdalene as one of the women who delivered the message of the angels. Starting in 24:8, it says, "And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles." If Mary Magdalene was one of the women who told these things, the angel's appearance at the tomb and the words they shared, to the disciples, she cannot have left the tomb before seeing any angels at all.
Objection!
Maybe there are differences between the appearances to the women, but these differences are better understood as deliberate narrative choices. Maybe the author of Matthew or John rearranged and compressed events to more effectively tell the story, which other authors at the time period were known to do. In that way, the differences between Matthew and John are less errors between different accounts, and more so deliberate use of literary devices by different authors. This explanation falsely assumes that literary devices cannot also be contradictions. If the author of John or Matthew deliberately moved the appearances of Jesus to a different location and a different time, that might have been a deliberate choice from the author, but it would still mean that one of the two accounts isn't true. It isn't what happened. If Jesus appeared to the women on the way back to the disciples, and the author of John changed it to an appearance at the tomb after telling the disciples, then John's description of events isn't true, even if he made those changes to better serve his idea of a narrative. Plus, in a book on this very subject, biblical scholar Michael Licona offers up the different appearances of Jesus to the women as one of the differences that cannot be properly explained as a literary device, saying, quote, "We have observed a number of differences in this periscope. Although many of them can be easily understood in light of the compositional devices we have observed being used by Plutarch and the evangelists elsewhere, there are several that leave us bewildered. 1. The location where Mary Magdalene first encountered the risen Jesus.
Objection!
Maybe the angel doesn't actually speak to the women while sitting on the stone in Matthew, and the author of Matthew is just describing the events of the morning out of order. The angel had descended and rolled back the stone earlier, and when the women arrive, he's moved to the inside of the tomb to deliver his message. The tense of word used in the Greek for the descent of the angel is also one that can easily refer to things that have happened before the other events described. So maybe the correct translation is more like, "And behold, there had been a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and had come and rolled back the stone and sat upon it." In that case, Matthew wouldn't disagree with Mark or Luke at all. This argument requires ignoring multiple parts of Matthew's text to work. The Greek word for behold that introduces the earthquake and the angel is one that Matthew's narrator most often uses to describe the next event that occurs in sequence to the same characters in question, so it's unlikely that the author of Matthew is jumping backwards to a different series of events when describing the descent of the angel and what they did. It is true that the verb describing the descent of the angel, the aorist tense, can sometimes be translated in past perfect to describe events that happened earlier. But the exact same verb tense is used for almost every other verb in the chapter, not just for the angel, but also for the actions of the women. There are two verbs that buck this trend, and it's the verbs that describe how the angel, quote, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow, end quote. Those two verbs are in the imperfect tense, which indicates incomplete and ongoing actions. So not only is it taken out of context to suggest that the tense of the verb for the angel's descent supports the idea that the angel wasn't on the stone when seen by the women, but it's also ignoring the deliberate change in verb tense, describing that the angel didn't just sit on the stone, he was continuing to sit there.
Objection!
If the women truly never told anyone about the angel's message as claimed by the end of Mark, how would the author of Mark know to write it down? They must have told eventually, otherwise we wouldn't even know about it. The author could have received the narrative from the Holy Spirit. Barring a more supernatural explanation, Jesus also could have relayed what had happened while he was in Galilee or while he was in Jerusalem.
Objection!
Maybe when Mark says that the women said nothing to anyone, he meant that the women didn't tell anyone other than the disciples on their way to deliver their message, which conveys their urgency. In Mark 1:44, Jesus tells a healed man to see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. And the phrasing of say nothing to anyone is very similar between the two stories. This supports the idea that the author of Mark doesn't mean that the women literally didn't tell anyone their message, just that they didn't share the story openly. For this explanation to work would require adding to the Bible things that aren't there. Blanket statements aren't read as having exceptions unless an exception is given. If I said that I never killed a man, it wouldn't make sense to interpret that as meaning I never killed a man until yesterday, unless I actually said until yesterday. In the same way, taking the author of Mark saying the women said nothing to anyone and interpreting that as meaning said nothing to anyone except the disciples doesn't make sense as an interpretation because the text doesn't say except the disciples. It's for that reason that Mark 1:44 isn't analogous, because in that passage, Jesus gives both a blanket statement, see that you say nothing to anyone, and an exception, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded. If the four Gospels have one account where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in two different ways, at different times, surrounded by different circumstances, and have one account where angels are in one place and others where they aren't, and have one account where the women share no message and others where they do, and one account where Mary Magdalene has witnessed angels and their message at the tomb and another where she hasn't, none of that means that the resurrection didn't happen. It doesn't mean that God isn't real, or that Christianity is false, or that the Gospels are nothing but lies. What it does mean is that the doctrine of inerrancy, the idea that the Bible is perfect, that everything in it is true, that doctrine is incorrect.